the way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
From financial ruin. Next slide, please. But I'm going with a much more conservative interest rate of 3%. With that, I arrive at a 2019 estimate of $19.14 trillion. Next slide, please. I should mention that merely doubling the interest rate to the more realistic 6% would exponentially blow up the total estimates to $6.6 quadrillion 2019 dollars. Next slide, please. Thus, the interest rate will be the most important figure to negotiate between the descendant community and the federal government should such negotiations begin in earnest. Next slide. So let me stick with a 3% compound interest estimate of $19.14 trillion. Next slide. Now, the average amount of reparations owed per US resident can be estimated by using the US Bureau of the Census's count of the 2019 US population, which included approximately 328 million individuals. This includes everyone who at least indirectly benefits from the startup capital that slavery provided to the US economy today. It includes first-generation immigrants like myself, as well as African-American descendants of the enslaved, as well as everybody else. Each US resident would owe on average $58,302. African-American descendants of the enslaved in the US would receive reparations in a larger amount, and the net amount, if you subtract that $58,000, would be $406,785 per eligible recipient in 2019 dollars. This means that wage-based reparations at only 3% interest would comfortably close the 2019 average per capita black-white wealth gap of $358,293. Next slide. Of course, this only addresses losses due to withheld wages during US slavery and thus lost inheritances. What is missing is colonial slavery as well as post-slavery de jure anti-black racial discrimination. And missing, according to Professor Swinton,
Welcome, everyone. Woo! Man, we're almost officially there. Chapter 13, The Wealth Gap, California Reparations Task Force Report, Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, 8:30 p.m. Pacific Standard. On the Fresh Coast, West Coast, East Coast, Fresh Coast, North Coast, Fresh Coast, South Coast, Fresh Coast, in the middle of America. Guess that's the mid Fresh Coast. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining. We will be starting shortly, and this is it. It's where the rubber meets the road, where the money talks. If anyone has yet, which I'm probably assuming that many people have already seen most of the task force hearings, definitely check that out. I was a clip from the task force hearings. Thomas Kramer was talking about lost wages from enslavement or for slavery here in the United States of America for people who descended from U.S. chattel slavery. So yeah, 6.6 6.6 quadrillion. My nilly. All right, we're gonna get into it, and let's see here. I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get this party started. Bum, 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 bum. All right, here we go. Introduction. Chapter 13, The Wealth Gap. Wealth, what you own minus what you owe, is the key to economic security. It is what enables families to build a better future. Wealth functions in many ways. It provides economic stability during lean times. It opens doors to improving quality of life. It is a dam against the floodwaters of economic catastrophes. It provides access to political power, and it allows us to live and retire with dignity. Wealth can also be passed down through generations, allowing children to live better lives than their parents and grandparents. It allows parents to pay for their children's college education. It allows grandparents to help a young family buy their first home. Throughout American history, government policies at all levels have helped white families collect these tools while preventing or undermining black families' ability to do the same. As a result, the wealth gap between black and white Americans is enormous and roughly the same today as it had been for 2 years before the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. In 2019, the median black household had a net worth of $24,100, less than 13% of the median net worth of white households at $188,200. I'm gonna post that in chat. So Miss Darlene Queen in the building. We did it, family. We did it. Thank y'all for joining. Shout out to Kim, man, for pitching in and holding down the fort, giving me a little break. But yeah, this has been a journey, family. This has been a journey, but the journey shall continue. Let's go. This wealth gap persists regardless of education level and family structure. I'm going to repeat that again. This wealth gap persists regardless of education level and family structure. Quick interjection. There might be a lot of interjections tonight. You know, I know there's been some Twitter stuff kind of going on about, you know, Kanye and some other stuff in the media. And it's unfortunate, you know, what's going down with Kanye. But you know, what we have to understand too is we have to understand when we talk about wealth gap, it hits everybody, right? And when you compare wealthy blacks to wealthy whites, there's a difference. If you have a chance, check out Blacklisted. We actually go into that where we talk about some of the quote unquote black media moguls to see their net worth compared to some other, you know, white media moguls. Now, I'm not taking anything away. I'm not saying that not being a multimillionaire or being a billionaire is some type of horrible thing or like, oh my gosh. But when you compare and do comparisons, you can see that gap there. So when you talk about collective ethnicities and collective groups here, then this wealth gap is atrocious. Anyway, so let's continue. I want to repeat it one more time. This wealth gap persists regardless of education level and family structure. So yes, it doesn't matter if you got your GED, no GED, BA, BS, no pun intended, MS, MA, PhD, DOJ, JEC, CO, whatever degree, you got your AA. I'm just making up stuff here. Your education level and family structure will still persist. The wealth gap will still persist. All right, here we go. For example, at the median, single black women over the age of 60 with a college degree at 11,000 have less than 3% of the wealth of single white women over the age of 60 with a college degree at 384,000. Wow. Single white parents have more than double the wealth, 35,000 at the median, than married black parents at 16,000. The wealth gap is present across all income levels. In 2016, estimates drawn from the Survey of Consumer Finances indicate that median white household in the bottom fifth of incomes, or the poorest quintile of white households, had a net worth of $21,700, which is greater than the median net worth of $18,601 for all black households. Black households in the bottom fifth of incomes had a median net worth of $27,000. And in another lifetime, net worth of $2,700, or maybe after reparations might get closer to $27,000. Anyway, less than 1/8 as much as the poorest quintile of white households. The trend is the same across social classes. In 2019, the median white working class household had a net worth of $114,270, while the median black professional managerial household had a net worth of $38,800. In the same year, white professional managerial households at $276,000 had a median net worth that was 8 times the median black professional managerial household and 19 times the median black working class household. This wealth gap is the result of the discrimination that African Americans experience, as described in the previous chapters. The American government at the federal, state, and local levels has systemically prevented black communities from building, maintaining, and passing on wealth. These harms cascade over a lifetime and compound over generations. The historical causes of the wealth gap is based in enslavement and legal segregation and continues through ongoing racial inequality and racism today. They include direct government creation of white wealth and destruction of black wealth through the support of racial terror, disenfranchisement, land theft, mass incarceration, exclusion of African Americans from government benefits, and banking discrimination. Interjection, facts on facts on facts on facts. Let's continue. Unequal home ownership, fewer assets, and lower business ownership continue to drive the wealth gap today. This has resulted in racial differences in the capacity of African Americans to transmit resources across generations, lower financial resilience during crisis, and homelessness. Section 2 discusses estimates of the contemporary racial wealth gap for the nation as whole, for California by gender, and for descendants of Africans enslaved in the United States. Section 3 describes historical causes of the racial wealth gap during enslavement and post-enslavement, including racial terror, land theft, mass incarceration, and discrimination in government benefits, the labor market, and banking. Section 4 discusses the drivers of the contemporary wealth gap today include unequal home ownership, fewer assets, and lower business ownership. Section 5 discusses the harmful effects of the wealth gap, which has resulted in racial differences in the capacity of African Americans to transmit resources across generations, lower financial resilience during crisis, and increased homelessness. Section 2, the contemporary racial wealth gap. National and California estimates. Significant research demonstrate that white Americans have long had a higher net worth than African Americans. The gap has changed little since 1989, when the median white household wealth was $143,000 and the median black household wealth was $9,000, approximately 94% less than white household wealth. Wow. That is nuts. The wealth gap was roughly the same in 2016 as it was in 1962, 2 years before the Civil Rights Act. Preliminary research suggests that despite rapid accumulation of wealth by African Americans in the decades after slavery and a narrowing of the racial wealth gap during World War II and the Civil Rights era, this progress halted by the mid-20th century, with the racial wealth gap widening over the last several decades. From 2005 to 2019, an interval that captures much of the impact of the Great Recession, median household wealth, all assets minus all debt among African Americans, fell 53% compared with a drop of 16% among white Americans. An asset is anything you own that adds financial value, as opposed to a liability, which is money you owe. Examples of personal assets include a home or other property, such as a rental house or commercial property, a checking or savings account, cars, financial and retirement accounts, gold, jewelry, and coins, collectibles and art, and life insurance policies. Wealth estimates can be demonstrated in median and mean figures, both of which are provided in this chapter. A median figure shows the worth of the middle household in each community. A mean figure shows the worth of the average household in the community. Some researchers suggest that the median is a more useful measure for estimating differences in wealth between black and white people because it is not affected by expectations like the few extremely rich individuals who would skew the average higher than is representative. However, researchers also suggest that the mean is the appropriate target measure for calculating the sum required to eliminate the racial wealth gap. Policymakers have usually focused on the median gap in wealth, which some researchers argue is not representative of what is happening to the average black or white person in reality. Comparing black and white wealth at the mean for the average household in each community shows a far larger wealth gap. Today, white American households continue to be far more likely to hold assets, and the types of assets they hold are worth, on average, more than that of black households. In 2019, the most recent year for which data is available, the total financial assets of white households is 9 times higher than black households. The median black household wealth was approximately $24,100, while the median white household wealth was approximately $188,200, a difference of $164,100. This mean for black household wealth is $142,300, while the mean for white household wealth is All right, here we go. The mean for black household wealth is $142,300, while the mean for white household wealth is close to $1 million at $983,400, a difference of $840,900. Just saying. Or at least the report is just saying. Differences in family structure also do not explain the racial wealth gap. Single white women with children have a higher median net worth than black women with no children. Oh, what? Single white women with children have a higher median net worth than black women with no children. At the median, single white parents have more than 2 times the wealth, $35,000, than married black parents at $16,000. Nor does effort or education. Wait, hold on a second. I think I messed up here. Anyway, I should have gone down, so I'm going to continue. I'm going to skip past that paragraph at the top and then continue on this paragraph that starts with nor does. So let me start with these words. It says this wealth. This wealth disparity cannot be explained by lack of personal motivation and effort, lack of financial literacy, family instability, lack of education, lack of home ownership, or lack of entrepreneurship on the part of African Americans. Can I get a amen? All right, we're going yeah, we're gonna put that one in the chat, family. I'm gonna read that again. This wealth disparity cannot be explained by lack of personal motivation and effort, lack of financial literacy, family instability, lack of education, lack of home ownership, or lack of entrepreneurship on the part of African Americans. Quick interjection. This whole idea and concept about picking yourself up by your bootstraps, that needs to go out the lexicon of black folk. Stop saying pick yourself up by your bootstraps, because not working, family. Not working. I'm not saying don't strive to be an entrepreneurship. Don't strive to be an entrepreneur, I should say, or get your education. Not saying that at all. However, the data is the data. Let's continue. For instance, there is very little, if any, evidence to support the claim that black saving behavior is the source of the enormous racial wealth gap. There is no significant difference in savings between black and white families with similar income levels, nor a difference in rates of return on their personal investments. In fact, in some income categories, black people display a higher rate of savings. And though African Americans have more family obligations on their income than white Americans because the relatives are more likely to need help than white Americans, the savings rate among black people is comparable to the savings rate at each level of household income among white people. Okay, I already read that paragraph, so we're going to skip to the next one. Nor does effort or education, nor comparable levels of family socioeconomic status. Black youth obtain more years of schooling and credentials, including college degrees, than white youth. And the wealth gap exists between black and white women, regardless of whether or not they have a bachelor's degree. Although the wealth gap and its causes in California and the nation is an understudied area, preliminary studies suggest that the racial wealth gap in California is the same or worse than it is at the national level. Some studies extrapolate California's racial wealth gap from national estimates. Direct California estimates of the racial wealth gap are only available for a single metropolitan area, Los Angeles. For a single metropolitan area, Los Angeles. 2016, while the median net worth of white Angelino households' assets minus debts was $355,000, median net worth of native-born black Angelino household was $4,000. And I'm going to just say, interjection, a whopping $4,000. Let's go. The average black household in Los Angeles had only just had 1% of the median wealth of the average white household, far worse than the national average of 10 to 15%. Gender-specific issues. The wealth gap between black men and black women, which is small, functions differently than the wealth gap between white men and white women, which is much larger. Black men and women have some similarly low wealth, although for slightly different reasons. The wealth gap between white men and women is largely because white men have traditionally had access to jobs that provide retirement accounts and other benefits available to careers not available to women. This difference in access does not exist between black men and women, as African Americans of all genders historically have been excluded from these benefits due labor discrimination, as discussed in Chapter 10, stolen labor and hindered opportunity. The median wealth for single black women is $200, while the median wealth of single black men is $300. Pause. Studies that show a greater wealth gap between black women and men do not appear to take into account incarcerated black men who are deprived of their ability to build wealth for themselves and their family during a prison sentence. Federal statistical agencies, including the U.S. Census Bureau, collect little information about people who are incarcerated, and they are excluded from household samples in national surveys. As a result, these individuals are invisible to most mainstream social institutions, lawmakers, and nearly all social science research not directly related to crime or criminal justice. And since African Americans are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white Americans, this has the effect of making it appear that African Americans are better off financially than they really are. As discussed below in Section 3, criminal convictions also create numerous barriers to wealth building even after the sentence ends. Still, black women face barriers to wealth building due to the combination of racism and sexism. As a result, there are vast differences in wealth between black women and both white men and white women. One study reports that in 2019, single black women's median net wealth was $7,000, while median net wealth for white women was $85,000 and $92,000 for single white men. While white men's median wealth was $28,900 in 2015, black women's median wealth was $200, less than 1 cent on every dollar of white men's median wealth. The large wealth gap faced by single black women is particularly important because black women are more and increasingly likely to be single and breadwinners. The marriage rate of African Americans aged 25 to 54 has declined since the early 1960s across all groups, but especially for black women, for whom it has halved to less than 40%. 1/3 of black women aged 25 to 54 are single with children in the household. Among black mothers, more than 80% are breadwinners compared to 50% of white mothers. At least half of unmarried black women have zero or negative assets. On average, black women do not accumulate net worth approaching retirement. They have no financial assets at age 50 and do not accumulate any more as they age. Black men also face a stark wealth gap with white women and men. One study reports that in 2015, median net wealth for black men was 15% of the median net wealth for white men and 16% of the wealth of white women. While white men's median wealth was $28,900 in 2015, black men's median was $300, about 1 cent on every dollar of white men's wealth. There does not appear to be extensive research on wealth gap estimates for black LGBTQ populations. Estimates based on immigration and migration patterns. Today, approximately 41.1 million black people live in the United States according to the 2020 census. Of those 41.1 million black individuals, experts differ on how many are the descendants of black people enslaved in the United States. About 12% of black people in America were born in a foreign country. 9% of African Americans have at least one foreign-born parent. By 2060, the black foreign-born population is projected to make up about 1/3 of the U.S. black population. 58% of black immigrants arrived in the United States after 2000. Of the current 2.8 million black Californians, 244,969 are foreign-born, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. Every U.S. census conducted since 1970 has found that black immigrants from the English-speaking Caribbean earn more, are more likely to be employed than U.S.-born African Americans, are more likely to hold more financial assets, are more likely to own their home, and most are more likely to be healthy than U.S.-born African Americans. There appears to be no data at the national and state level and limited scholarship at the city level describing the wealth gap between descendants of black people enslaved in the United States, recent black immigrants, and white Americans. Well, that's going to change, family. Right now. That is going to change in the future. All right. Shout out to California, SB 189. That's the first step. And I can't predict the future, so this is just hearsay. But currently, the OMB is actually doing reaching out to the community, trying to get some feedback in terms of ethnicity and racial classifications among its population. And so there's a lot of people from the freedmen community that have been giving testimony and having meetings with the OMB. So I don't know, hopefully they'll be starting to disaggregate data in the near future, but that's just a heads up. Interjection. Let's continue. Very few of the city level studies present findings on the wealth gap that disaggregates the racial category of black by national origin. Some scholars argue that the effects of systemic racism have uniquely harmed African American descendants of slavery when compared to black immigrants who do not have the same experience of systemic racial discrimination in the United States. One study, The Color of Wealth in Los Angeles, included separate data for U.S.-born African Americans and recent immigrants from Africa. National origin and race were both self-reported in this study. On average, white Angelenos were far more likely to hold assets in stocks, mutual funds, and investment trusts than both U.S.-born and African Black Angelenos. But African Black Angelenos were likely to hold more assets than U.S.-born Black Angelenos. For example, 87% of African Black Angelenos own liquid assets versus 62% of Black Angelenos born in the United States. 80% of African Black Angelenos had a checking account versus 68% of U.S.-born, 68%, dang, of U.S.-born African Americans. 80% of African Black Angelenos had a savings account versus 56% of U.S.-born Black Angelenos. Such studies in other cities reflect comparable wealth gaps between U.S.-born African Americans and recent immigrants. Historical causes of the racial wealth gap. The modern racial wealth gap between African Americans and other racial groups began with enslavement, but scholars debate whether enslavement should be the basis for reparations, given that today's wealth gap is the cumulative effects of racism over centuries. Facts. This section describes historical causes of the racial wealth gap during and post-slavery, including racial terror, land theft, mass incarceration, and discrimination in government benefits, the labor market, and banking. Enslavement. Several scholars have estimated the slavery bill for reparations. Most of these estimates require a calculation in today's dollars for unpaid wages, the purchase prices of human property, or the land promised to the formerly enslaved. These estimates are generated by multiplying earlier values by a compounding interest rate. For example, Thomas Kramer's calculations for unpaid wages owed to enslaved people amounts to $19.4 trillion in today's dollars. He arrives at this number by multiplying the prevailing average market wage by the number of hours worked for each 24-hour day by those enslaved over the interval of 1776 to 1865 and applies a 3% interest rate, merely doubling the interest rate to the more realistic 6% would increase the total estimate to 6.6 quadrillion in 2019 dollars. Okay, family. I think we played that clip. So yeah. So Camila Moore, how you doing, sis? Thanks for joining. Yeah. Facts. Let's continue. Similar to Kramer's estimates is James Marchetti's bill, using the idea of income diverted from enslaved persons, arriving at a figure of 2.1 trillion as of 1983. Using a 6% interest rate, the 2018 value amounts to 17.1 trillion. Other estimates are reached by calculating the value in today's dollars of the wealth held in enslaved people as property. For example, Judah P. Benjamin, a critical member of Jefferson Davis's Confederate cabinet, proclaimed the value of enslaved persons in 1860 to be $4 billion. $4 billion, which compounds to 42.2 trillion by 2019 at a 6% interest rate. Other scholars argue that these large sums are underestimates because they do not account for the physical and emotional harms of enslavement. Underestimates. The coercive nature of the system, the denial of the ability to acquire property, or the deprivation of autonomy. Post-enslavement. The case for reparation extends beyond slavery to the near century-long era of legal segregation, violence, and terror, and the atrocities that continue today. Mass incarceration, police killings of unarmed African Americans, sustained credit, housing, employment discrimination, and the immense black-white wealth disparity. Scholars have divided post-slavery American history into 5 overlapping phases of federal government policies, which created the modern racial wealth gap. They involve white wealth creation through government land grants and mortgage subsidies, and black wealth destruction through racial terror, eminent domain, and mass incarceration. White wealth creation through government land grants. From 1862 to 1976, the federal government transferred massive amounts of land, mostly to white families. Some scholars have named this phase the wagon train phase. I want to put that in the chat so we know this is the wagon train phase. All right, here we go. Okay. In 1862, the federal government established the Homestead Act, which distributed land until about 1980, although more occasionally after the 1920s. So I just need to write this down real quick. Just taking a quick note, and we'll get back on the reparations train. All right. In 1862, the federal government established the Homestead Act, which distributed land until about 1980, although more occasionally after the 1920s. The Homestead Act encouraged Western migration by providing American citizens and immigrants, soon-to-be citizens, up to 160 acres of public lands, which was increased to 320 acres in 1909 for $0 if they continuously lived on a property for 5 years and paid a small $10 filing fee. Homesteaders also had the option of paying $1.25 per acre if they lived on a property for 6 months. While the language of the act did not exclude people based on race, African Americans were unable to secure land allocations under the Act for 4 years until the Civil Rights Act of 1866 clarified that they were citizens. California's homestead law similarly excluded African Americans before 1900 because they required a homesteader to be a white citizen. Though black homesteaders were able to secure land allocations under the Act after 1866, they were few in comparison to the multitudes of white settlers and had to settle for the least desirable land. Between 1868 and 1934, the federal government gave 246 million acres of land essentially for free to mostly white, native-born, and immigrant Americans. An area close to the size of California and Texas combined. More than 1.5 million white families received land patents, and today as many as 446 million of their living descendants reap the wealth benefits, approximately 1/4 of the adult population of the United States. Reverse, repeat, reverse, repeat. Let's do this. More than 1.5 million white families receive land grants, and today as many as 46 million of their living descendants reap the wealth benefits, approximately 1/4 of the adult population of the United States. Let's continue. In comparison, and as an example, approximately 3,500 black claimants succeeded in obtaining their patents from the General Land Office in the Great Plains, granting them ownership of approximately 650,000 acres of prairie land. The federal government undermined other efforts to allocate land to the formerly enslaved. Another estimate of reparations to African Americans can be made by calculating the value in today's dollars of the unfulfilled land distribution of 40 acres and a mule promised to the formerly enslaved beginning in 1865. Boom. On January 16, 1865, upon seizing the coastline from Charleston, South Carolina to Johns River, Florida, General Sherman, I think his full name is Tecumseh Sherman. Anyway, General Sherman issued Special Field Orders number 15 that established the provision of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground designated for the settlement of the Negroes, now made free by the acts of war and the proclamation of the President of the United States. The order carved out 400,000 acres of land confiscated or abandoned by Confederates. Each family of formerly enslaved black people would get up to 40 acres. Oh my gosh. Man, what black folks can't do with 40 acres today. Anyway, the Army would lend them mules no longer in use. Further, the Freedmen's Bureau Act of March 3, 1865 had an explicit racial land redistribution provision that specified that not more than 40 acres of land was to be provided to refugee or freed male citizen at 3 years annual rent, not exceeding 6% of the value of the land based on appraisal of the state tax authorities in 1860. At the end of 3 years of occupying the land, they could purchase it and receive title. Similar provisions were included in the post-war Southern Homestead Act of 1866. Freedmen were to receive land in the southern states at a price of $5 for 80 acres. Quick interjection. Yeah, it's crazy, man. If I recall correctly, I remember speaking to my grandfather before he passed away, or actually distributed a book by my great aunt. And she talked about her childhood growing up in the South. And if I recall correctly, I think he had to lease the land because I don't think he could afford it. So I'm just kind of imagining, like, if this 40 acres and a mule, this special field order 15, actually went through, how many, black folks wouldn't have had to lease out land. Anyway, let's continue. Sorry for getting on my soapbox. President Andrew Johnson intensely opposed these acts, and neither were effectively implemented on behalf of the formerly enslaved. By the end of 1865, Johnson also had ordered the removal of thousands of formerly enslaved persons from the lands they had settled under Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15, which were ultimately given back to former enslavers. With the exception of a small number who had legal land titles, freed black people were removed from the land as a result of President Johnson's restoration program. If 4 million enslaved persons had gained emancipation by 1865, and the land allocation rule meant that roughly 40 acres would go to families of 4, each formerly enslaved individual would have been allocated about 10 acres. This implies a total distribution of at least 40 million acres of land. Using a conservative estimate of $10 per acre, the total value of the projected distribution of land to the freedmen would have been $400 million in 1865. The value in today's dollars at a 6% interest rate would be $1.3 trillion. This number would be much higher if the conditions of the Southern Homestead Act, which provided for 80 acres of land to be sold to freedmen at $5 total, were treated as a debt to be paid to the descendants of the formerly enslaved. If, as some scholars interpret, each freedman was eligible to receive 40 acres of land, it would have led to much higher total value of the land to be distributed to freedmen after the war, amounting to $1.6 billion in 1865 and compounding to $12.6 trillion at a 6% interest rate in 2019. Black wealth destruction through racial terror. From 1865 to the present, federal, state, and local government actors refused to protect African Americans as they face violence and land theft. Sometimes government actors joined, led, or supported the violence. As detailed in Chapter 3, Racial Terror, white federal, state, and local government officials working jointly with private citizens terrorized African Americans to prevent them from accumulating political and economic power. White mobs destroyed thriving black communities in racial massacres nationwide in Louisiana, North Carolina, Michigan, Delaware, Nebraska, Florida, Illinois, Oklahoma, Texas, and elsewhere. The most well-known was the destruction of the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The Greenwood District was popularly known as Black Wall Street. Scholars estimate that the present value of destroyed black property in Tulsa is at least $100 million. The 1909 massacre in Elaine, Arkansas, destroyed $10 million of the black wealth. Yeah, I don't know. We actually, with the reparations documentary, we actually went down and spoke to, actually, he's a friend of relatives of my family, down in Allensworth. So when the documentary comes out, definitely check that out. It was eye-opening discussion and experience. But Allensworth itself, that's another one right here in California. So let's go. Evidence exists that murders of African Americans continue to be driven by underlying economic incentives. Police killings of unarmed African Americans frequently occur in neighborhoods undergoing white gentrification. White wealth creation through mortgage subsidies. In the 19th century, federal, state, and local governments passed laws and implemented practices that heavily subsidized the creation of the white middle class while substantively crippling the ability of black people to do the same. Federal policies implemented by private citizens focus on helping mostly white Americans buy single-family homes, as discussed in Chapter 5, The Root of Many Evils, Housing Segregation. the Veterans Administration, the Federal Housing Administration, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation helped white families buy single-family homes in the suburbs while preventing black families from doing the same. Beginning in the 1930s and 1940s, the federal government created programs to subsidize low-cost loans and opened up home ownership to millions of average Americans for the first time. At the same time, government underwriters introduced a national appraisal system tying property value and loan eligibility in part to neighborhood racial composition, which designated predominantly non-white neighborhoods as hazardous and coloring these areas red, a process known as redlining. White communities receive the highest ratings and benefit from low-cost, government-backed loans. Minority and mixed neighborhoods, and especially black neighborhoods, received the lowest ratings and were denied these loans. This functionality concentrated African Americans into impoverished neighborhoods in America's urban centers. Of the $124 billion worth of new housing subsidies between 1934 and 1962, less than 2% went to non-white families, virtually locking them out of home ownership. Okay, pause real quick. Yeah, family, I don't know, Darlene, if you're still in there, or Kim, or somebody in the chat. I think recently the realtors, I don't know if that was here in California or if that was nationwide. I just can't remember. So don't quote me, but I think one of the realtors company actually apologized recently. So yeah, family, if you do have that information, if you don't mind putting that in the chat, please do. If not, no sweat. It's in the notes, and I'm just gonna write that down so just so I can remember. Realtors Association apologizes. Now I can't remember the exact realtor agency or company, or if they're an association or something, but I do remember there was an apology made recently. All right, today approximately 3 in 4 neighborhoods, 74% that the federal government deemed hazardous in the 1930s remain low to moderate income, and more than 60% are predominantly non-white. Black wealth destruction through disenfranchisement and land theft. As described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, the federal government passed the National Highway Act of 1956 and urban renewal legislation. Funded by the federal government, state and local officials used eminent domain to destroy thriving black communities in the name of highway construction and urban renewal. Erasing generations of accumulated black wealth. Black businesses districts were cleaved by the highways and never recovered. In the mid-20th century, the United States Department of Agriculture's USDA policies discriminated against and displaced black. During the Civil Rights era, federal anti-discrimination statutes that applied to the USDA were diluted by the time they reached the local level and did not provide protection for black farmers. White USDA administrators gave millions of dollars to funding to all white Southern local agricultural committees. These powerful committees were county arms of the USDA and did not want black farmers on their boards, so they would prevent their election by splitting the black vote or through voter intimidation tactics. These boards made decisions on loan recipients, acreage allotments, appropriate crop yields, hardship adjustments, and preferred farming methods benefiting white farmers. All right, let's see. All right, I'm trying to see. Did they have a date in there? The 20th century United States Department of Agriculture policies. I guess they're just saying mid-20th century. Okay. Wow. The Farmers Home Administration was another agency that discriminated against and displaced black farmers. The agency offered loans and credit to poor farmers for home construction and improvement, but instead of going to badly needed rural housing in the South, these loans went to segregated swimming pools, picnic areas, tennis courts, and golf courses in white communities. Loan requirements were stringent and often subjective, such as whether an applicant was a good citizen. Loans went to the white and wealthy, while black farmers were turned down. Even if a black farmer received a loan, agency administrators would seek to get rid of them by luring them into debt and then foreclosing and auctioning off their machinery. As a result, black farmers were pushed off their land. Lawrence Lucas, President Emeritus of the United States Department of Agriculture Coalition of Minority Employees, testified that the USDA's programs continue to discriminate against black farmers and that a culture of systemic racism at the USDA that denies black farmers their dignity, that denies black farmers the right to farm, denies black farmers the right to the same programs and services that white farmers get in this country is still present today. In 1910, black farmers owned 16 million acres of land. In 2007, they owned 3.2 million acres and 80,000 lost. In 1999, black farmers filed a class action lawsuit against the USDA for unlawful discrimination against them in denying their farm loan applications. The lawsuit, Pigford versus Glickman, ultimately settled for money damages, but no policy changes at the USDA. While many claims have been paid, the USDA nonetheless has been slow to pay out all the claims and has spent extensive resources in fighting claims. In the 2021 the C virus relief bill, $4 billion was set aside for debt relief for socially disadvantaged farmers, including black farmers, but payments have been stopped due to an ongoing lawsuit alleging it is reverse racism and a windfall for some farmers. Wow. Black wealth destruction through mass incarceration. In the late 1980s, mass incarceration and the war on drugs continued the American government historical criminalization of African Americans. As discussed in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, African Americans have experienced marginalization, physical harm, and death at the hands of the American criminal justice system at both the federal and state level, beginning in slavery and continuing today. During the slavery era, federal and state governments criminalized African Americans as a method of establishing, maintaining, and socially controlling African Americans as a lower class of human being than white Americans. Today, mass incarceration continues to separate families and dehumanize the descendants of enslaved black people. In the 156 years since slavery was abolished, black people in the United States have gone from being considered less than human under the law to being treated as less than human by a criminal justice system that punishes them more harshly than white people. Let's see here. All right. Until the 1940s, state laws and the U.S. Constitution allowed private entities to force African Americans into doing the same work on the same land and even for the same people as during slavery in a system called convict leasing. People who were leased were treated even more brutally than enslaved people because plantation owners had a financial incentive to keep enslaved people alive. Working and living conditions for incarcerated people were dangerous, unhealthy, and violent. Most incarcerated people who were leased for labor did not survive to complete 10-year sentences. Until mid-1950s, states routinely forced chain gangs of imprisoned people to do public works projects while wearing chains weighing as much as 20 pounds. American politicians ran on law and order or tough on crime platforms and passed laws and policies that punished African Americans more than white Americans, often for similar crimes. This has contributed to mass incarceration and overrepresentation of African Americans in the criminal justice system to the present day, nationwide and in California. Nearly 70% of young black men will be in prison at some point in their lives, and poor black men with low levels of education make up a disproportionate share of incarcerated Americans. Mass incarcerations create a vicious cycle. Studies have shown that lower wealth increases the likelihood of incarceration, and incarceration decreases the ability to build or maintain wealth. African Americans who have lower family wealth than white Americans are especially vulnerable to incarceration. Growing up with less family wealth means living in poorer neighborhoods with lower quality education and a greater exposure to high street crime and high imprisonment areas. 62% of African Americans live in highly segregated inner city neighborhoods where socioeconomic vulnerabilities contribute to higher rates of violent crime, while the majority of white Americans live in highly advantaged neighborhoods where there is little violent crime. Quick pause. We actually spoke to a brother as well when we were down in Los Angeles during I think it was the Juneteenth festival. And, you know, it was for the documentary. And we were just going on the beach down in Bruce's Beach. And we just happened to run across this brother. Shout out to Kim. She was there too. And, you know, he was just talking about, you know, the atrocities, the historical atrocities that happened down in Southern California, specifically in Los Angeles. You know, dealing with crime and then white flight and the whole nine. So anyway, it's a shame. Let's continue. Mass incarceration has been catastrophic to the ability of Black families to build and maintain wealth by reducing household assets and income and lowering home ownership rates. As discussed in detail in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, the criminalization of African Americans has contributed to racial disparities at every step of the criminal justice system. In 2019, African Americans comprised 26% of all arrests, yet they only made up 13.4% of the population. According to a recent large-scale analysis of racial disparities in over 60 million state patrol police stops in 20 states, including California, researchers found that police officers stop African Americans more often than white drivers relative to their share of the driving age population. Further, these researchers found that after controlling for age, gender, time, and location, police are more likely to ticket, search, and arrest African American drivers than white Americans. Thus, in practice, the bar for searching African American drivers is lower than for searching white Americans. Low family wealth can also mean being unable to afford additional education and delaying entering the labor market, leading to higher risks of incarceration. Once a person is a criminal defendant, low family wealth makes it hard to post bond or to hire lawyers to help navigate the criminal justice system, making incarceration more likely. In 2009, African Americans made up less than 13% of the U.S. population, but comprised over a third of all the people in prison. As explained in Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, African Americans are also more likely to be convicted and experience lengthy prison sentences. Involvement in the criminal justice system increases legal debt. Incarceration means loss of income and may lead to missed mortgage payments and other debts. This increases interest obligations and penalties, which in turn can send an incarcerated individual's credit score plummeting. Incarceration also means household instability, placing an additional barrier to building wealth. Okay, quick interjection. I don't know if this report's going to actually be talking about child support as well. You know, when brothers get, you know, locked up, and I don't know, maybe sisters get locked up too. I mean, we got to think about that too. You know, they're on the hook for paying child support too, right? Now, hopefully, you know, a judge is sympathetic, and I can't recall, so don't quote me on this. But I do believe that at one point there was supposed to be something in legislation saying that imprisonment, that you weren't gonna, layman's terms, weren't gonna have to pay for child support if you were in prison or responsible. I could be wrong, but anyway, that's just something to note. Let's continue. As Chapter 11 explains, federal and state prisons continue to exploit the labor of predominantly Black incarcerated people. While convict leasing as an official practice has ended, underpaid or unpaid prison labor continues today as incarcerated people are not protected by labor laws. For example, in house prison labor, the most common type of prison labor typically refers to jobs within and related to the prison, including kitchen duty, cleaning, or groundskeeping. Workers can be punished and sent to solitary confinement for taking a sick day, including in the 8 states where the labor is unpaid. In states where prison labor is paid, the average rates across the U.S. range from 14 to 63 cents per hour. These are the rates before wage garnishment, which can account for up to half of one's earnings, although some advocates argue that wage garnishment serves as appropriate sources for victims' restitution. In addition to jobs within the prison, incarcerated people also provide underpaid and underprotected industry labor unrelated to maintaining the prison, like phone banking, packaging, and textile work. Participating private companies must pay minimum wage, which the prison garnishes for the incarcerated person's room and board in prison cells. The garnishment only applies to basic room and board, and the incarcerated person must pay additionally for stamps, paper, toiletries, supplementary food, or phone calls. Advocates argue that such costs are not fairly calculated and that the American criminal justice system is filled with fees that shift the cost of incarceration not only to the incarcerated, but also to their families. Scholars argue that work programs in incarceration are not beneficial to incarcerated people when they seek work after their incarceration. Once released from incarceration, criminal convictions make it harder to find and maintain jobs, find leases, and be approved for mortgages. A record of previous incarceration also has wide-ranging immediate and future consequences that act as a barrier to employment, thus lowering earnings. A criminal conviction makes it difficult to build wealth because of stigmatization, and lack of access to support, social institution, and credit. All right, so I'm going to kind of see where we're at here. Let's see, that's 4, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay. All right, family, we're going all the way through. All right, so it's about 9:40. Hopefully we'll get out by 10:30, but not guaranteed. We might be kicking it till 11. So if y'all want to hang all the way through, might be later, I don't know, but we finishing this thing tonight. That's one thing I do know. All right. So appreciate you. Thank you for coming through. Thank you, Kim, for that. As always, Kim, California Social Resources Project. There you go. Boom. All right. Exclusion and discrimination in government benefits. African Americans have consistently been excluded from numerous major categories of government benefits, which have generally benefited white Americans. Government benefits refer to assistance programs that provide either cash assistance or in-kind benefits to individuals' families from a government entity. There are 2 major types of government benefit programs: social welfare programs and social insurance programs. Benefits received from social welfare programs are usually based on low income. Benefits received from social insurance programs are usually based on other criteria such as age, employment status, or being a veteran. Some of the major federal, state, and local social insurance programs are Social Security, veterans benefits, unemployment insurance compensation, and workers' compensation. Social insurance programs can provide important support in times of crisis. Unemployment insurance, a state-level program, helps protect against unexpected drops in income by paying cash payments to unemployed workers who have lost jobs through no fault of their own. The Federal Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, known as SNAP, also known as food stamps, out here I think it's called CalFresh, I could be wrong. Anyway, gives money to low-income families to buy food and expands to provide important support when people lose their jobs. Recipients have improved food security, health, and reduced health care expenses. Historically, federal policy decisions dealing with welfare work, and war in the 1930s and 1940s excluded or discriminated against the vast majority of African Americans. The exclusion and discrimination continued due to the congressional representatives elected from southern states that created barriers to African Americans voting. Among other things, southern legislatures prevented Congress from including anti-discrimination provisions in an expansive range of social welfare programs, such as community health services, school lunches, and hospital construction grants. All the programs that distributed funds to the South. As a result, when federal policies provided most white Americans with valuable tools to build wealth, ensure their old age, get good jobs, acquire economic security, build assets, and gain middle-class status, most African Americans were left out. Social Security, passed and signed by President Roosevelt in 1935, left out most African Americans for the first quarter century of its existence. Southern congressional representatives heavily influenced the Social Security Act with devastating results. The federal government gave the power to control benefit levels, eligibility, and administration of such programs of the states and excluded occupations mostly held by African Americans. At the time, 65% of African Americans fell outside of eligibility for the Social Security program, and between 70 and 80% fell outside eligibility requirements in different parts of the South. All right. For example, in 1940, the year Social Security payments for seniors began, the Social Security Board identified nearly 2.3 million black workers as eligible for old age insurance, but the majority of those identified were disqualified because they were farm or domestic workers. Here we go. The harms just keep piling up. These exclusions continued until 1954, when the occupational exclusions were eliminated. This exclusion also left most black workers out of unemployment insurance under the Act. When black workers qualified by working in eligible industrial and commercial jobs, they often were left out because they lacked a history of regular, stable employment. When they received benefits, the benefits tended to be smaller than those received by white workers. Another example of federal government discrimination in benefits are the mortgage subsidies, which not only intensified residential segregation as discussed in detail in Chapter 5, housing discrimination, but also helped white families build wealth and enter the middle class. The federal government supported the creation and maintenance of the white middle class through other programs as well. The New Deal was a collection of government programs with the goal of lifting America out of the Great Depression. One example of a New Deal policy was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill. Which was reinforced in 1948 with the integration of the Armed Forces Act. Through these laws, the federal government aimed to offer unprecedented benefits to veterans, including mortgages to buy homes, job placement services, money for vocational and university education, and loans for small businesses. However, these programs were administered by the states, which discriminated against Southern black veterans. While white World War II veterans sent themselves and their children to college and obtained housing and small business grants, black veterans were not able to do so in the same way. Part of this stemmed from discrimination in the military. Black soldiers were more likely to be issued neutral and dishonorable discharges, sometimes used to exclude black veterans from GI Bill benefits. Ira Katznelson argues that severe discrimination in the GI Bill administration system prevented black veterans from obtaining home mortgages, small business, and farm loans. Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, discusses how other New Deal programs excluded African Americans in detail. All right, New Deal. Today, African American families continue to have trouble accessing government benefits because welfare programs are often administered at the state and local levels. State and especially local governments have been able to introduce racial bias into welfare administration, contributing to racial disparate outcomes. States have been significantly more likely to both adopt and impose welfare sanctions if they have higher proportions of non-white welfare recipients. States with higher black populations, generally in the South, tend to provide fewer unemployment payments for a shorter time. Additionally, in many places, part-time workers who are disproportionately black are not eligible for unemployment payments. Despite having higher unemployment rates in general, black workers receive unemployment benefits at lower rates than white Americans. A report by the Government Accountability Office found that 73% of black unemployment applicants received unemployment payments during the pandemic versus 82% of white applicants. Although governments have waived work requirements for some SNAP recipients during certain national crises like the C-19 pandemic, studies have found that work requirements disproportionately cut off black adults from SNAP benefits, which may be partially due to discrimination in the labor market, making the job search more difficult for black people. During the C-19 pandemic, most households received several stimulus checks from the federal government. Studies have found that these payments were likely crucial to help households that lost jobs that paid their expenses. The federal government supplemented state unemployment payments with up to $600 a week for unemployed workers, extended the duration of benefits, and gave benefits to workers traditionally left out of unemployment insurance programs. The federal government also instituted the Paycheck Protection Program to provide loans that enable businesses suffering from C-19 economic shocks to pay their employees and other costs. During the pandemic, even though African Americans were more likely to hold the types of jobs most severely impacted by the pandemic, white households received their C-19 stimulus checks faster than black households. This was likely due to the Internal Revenue Service focused structure of the program, which made receiving the payment more complicated for unbanked families and families who did not file taxes. Black people are more likely to be among both groups. Studies of pandemic-era federal loans have found that 29% of black applicants were successful in obtaining loans for their businesses versus 60% of white applicants. Businesses in majority black neighborhoods were also more likely to receive federal loans later than businesses in majority white neighborhoods. Federal money was paid out through large banks, which historically excluded black businesses. Black business owners may have been less likely to obtain them, despite being more likely than white businesses owners to have at-risk or distressed businesses even before the pandemic. Education, segregation, and debt. Higher education for African Americans can have a positive effect on their income, but does not translate into a reduction in wealth gap. College degrees do little to close the racial wealth gap. For example, college-educated African American households have 30 to 33% less wealth at the median than non-college educated white households. For example, and I'll repeat, college-educated African American households have 30 to 33% less wealth at the median than non-college educated white households. Yep. Average wealth for white Americans in this category is $180,500, while the African American average is $23,400. As Rucker C. Johnson testified before the Reparations Task Force, affluent black households with incomes above $75,000 still live in more under-resourced neighborhoods with under-resourced school than their white counterparts, which disadvantages black students from the start of childhood. Black students carry more student loan debt because they receive a higher interest on their student loans, and they borrow more because their families are less wealthy than white students. For example, 20 to 29-year-old single white women who have completed college have a median net worth of $3,400. Single black women of a similar age and level of education have a median net worth of negative $11,000. Negative $11,000. Labor market discrimination. Income is different from wealth. Income represents how much a person earns in a lifetime, both from work and from a yearly return on their investments. Wealth represents a person's total net worth calculated from assets minus debts. While income plays a modest role in the ability to generate wealth, as lower income translates to reduced capacity for savings or investments. Income does not explain massive black-white wealth disparities in the United States. Without savings or wealth of some form, which can be passed from generation to generation, economic stability quickly falls apart when income is cut or disrupted through job loss, reduced work hours, or reduced wages, or families suffer from an unexpected health emergency. Facts on facts on facts on facts on facts. All right, here we go. In fact, the end of wealth? Oh, the intergenerational transfer and impact of wealth is one of the reasons why racial wealth inequalities have become entrenched. As detailed in Chapter 10, Stolen Labor and Hindered Opportunity, labor market discrimination significantly contributes to the wealth gap. Some scholars have based their estimates for reparations on more recent economic injustices such as labor market discrimination. Bernadette Cashier and Gerald Udinski estimated the monetary benefits that white workers gained from employment discrimination between 1929 and 1969. They concluded that by the mid-1980s, white workers gained in $1.6 trillion from employment discrimination at the expense of black workers. Assuming that 40% of the black-white income gap was because of labor market discrimination. David Swinton concludes that even if one subtracted the total cost of government benefit programs, including Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment, insurance, and other welfare programs, which are often argued to be reparations, over the same time span from the Cashier, sorry fam, I'm messing up your name, and Udinski estimate, there would still be a $500 billion net worth benefit to white people from labor market discrimination by the mid-1980s. But income alone cannot explain the racial wealth gap. A reduction in racial differences in income will leave as much as 3/4 of the wealth gap unaddressed. Similar achievements do not lead to similar wealth for African Americans in comparison to white Americans. For example, between 1984 and 2009, every dollar increase in average income for white households added $5.19 in wealth. The same increase in average incomes for African American households added only 69 cents in wealth. In fact, the racial wealth gap increases as income increases. The wealth gap between African Americans and whites in the bottom fifth of income levels is $7,400, but the wealth gap comparable African Americans and whites in the top fifth of income levels is $264,700. And while white households have 5 to 10 times the net worth of African American households, they only earn twice as much as African American households. Within the same income brackets, African American wealth is less than 1/2 that of white people. White people in the bottom fifth of the income distribution have more than 10 times the median wealth of African Americans in the bottom fifth. Lower incomes for African Americans because of labor market discrimination affect wealth only to the extent that it reduces capacity for savings that can be passed across generations. There is no evidence that African Americans have a lower savings rate than white Americans once household income is taken into account. One study found that once income is taken into account, if anything, African American families actually have a slightly higher savings rate than their white counterparts. The goats in the building, what's up, bro? Brother Chris Lawson in the building, what's up, fam? Putting in that work. All right, let's continue. At high level incomes, African Americans save more than white people who tend to invest. In addition to savings from income or active savings, a family's wealth can also increase because of passive savings or when the value of a family's assets rises or appreciates. Data collected before the predatory subprime mortgage market crisis shows that there is no significant racial advantage in passive savings for white families with positive assets after family income is taken into account. Discrimination in banking. African Americans have historically faced systemic discrimination in banking, which has impacted their ability to accumulate wealth. Banks established by the federal government discriminated against African Americans and deprived them of wealth. The Freedmen's Fund, Free Labor and Union Army military banks, and the Freedmen's Bank were three banking institutions established by the federal government in the early to mid 1860s. Freedmen's Bureau Bank, which provided recently emancipated African Americans with the means to save the money they earned. But racist, paternalistic attitudes by government officials prevented African Americans from investing their own money and accumulating wealth. Bank employees improperly invested client savings and lost approximately $2.9 million or $63 million in 2017 dollars, harming freedmen and their descendants for generations to come. In another example, Union Army chaplain John Eaton created the Freedmen's Fund in 1862 to hold the wages of formerly enslaved African Americans who fled to the Union or who worked for Union troops. These freedmen had no access to their individual wages or savings, nor did they have any say in how they owned wages or the money that was donated for their benefit would be used. Instead, Eaton pooled the wages in the fund to collectively provide food, shelter, and other needs, essentially treating freedmen as contract laborers. Eaton also stole all their wealth. All right, John Eaton. Put this dude in the chat. Eaton also stole all their wealth. Soldiers confiscated horses, wagons, money, and other valuables that self-emancipated African Americans brought with them to the Union lines. Eaton took anything that the soldiers and quartermasters did not steal for themselves. By 1864, he had formalized his contract labor system to negotiate contracts for and hired out black workers on abandoned plantations that the federal government had leased to Northerners and to some Southerners who supported the Union. Any profits from the cash crops that black workers grew and harvested were placed in the Freedmen's Fund. Eaton also used the fund for other expenses. In 1 year alone, Eaton stole $103,000 or $1.6 million in 2017 dollars from black depositors to pay for Union Army's incidental expenses, $5,000 in medical expenses, the salaries, all hospital stewards, and medical assistants. The free labor and Union Army military banks first established in 1864 was other bank that used an exploitative model of contracting black people's labor similar to Eaton's Freedmen's Fund. Man, this is crazy. All right, so Johnny Friedman. Oh, this dude. All right. Man, bro, what is up? John Eaton. If this dude got like, obviously interjection. If this dude got like descendants, people still living from his family, they need to come up off all that. That's all I know. They need to come up off all that. Come up off all that you got. Come up. You need to come up with it. I don't know what you need to do. Whoever's John Eaton's relatives. Let's continue. In 1865, Congress created the Freedmen's Bank and Trust Company, also known as the Freedmen's Savings Bank, seeding the bank with unclaimed deposits from the free labor and military banks. The initial charter designated an all-white board of trustees with broad discretion to oversee the bank and intended to hold only the deposits of the survivors of enslavement and their descendants. Despite this nominal limitation, the bank welcomed customers of all races and regardless of whether they were formerly enslaved. Okay, I'm going to repeat that because it seemed like the same stuff's happening here. I'm going to repeat that. The initial character designated an all-white board of trustees with broad discretion to oversee the bank and intended to hold only the deposits of the survivors of enslavement and their descendants. Survivors of enslavement and their descendants. Okay, this is really important. I'm going to repeat this because history is currently repeating itself. Despite this nominal limitation, the bank welcomed customers of all races. And regardless of whether they were formerly enslaved, the formerly enslaved people made up the vast majority of bank customers. And though the charter made clear that its purpose was to invest the deposits in low-risk treasury notes and conservative U.S. securities, it vaguely stated that a third of the deposits called, quote, available funds, end quote, could be invested anywhere, leaving an opening for abuse. Okay, quick interjection. I know we're going to finish it up tonight. I know we're going to do that, family, but it's a quick interjection. If we ever have some type of Freedman agency or New Freedman Bank, there's got to be some accountability. There has to be some type of accountability because this can absolutely not happen ever again. This is crazy. People work hard. I mean, just imagine, man, you enslaved all this time, get your freedom, and your money just gone. Nowhere to be found, just boom. And then, so you can't leave nothing to your descendants, your offspring, man. And then they gave, compensation to the enslavers. All right, let's go. The Freedmen's Bank used a number of aggressive methods and tactics to solicit deposits and to convince Black patrons that their money was safe and that they could grow wealth. Past books and other bank literature contain numerous slogans and poems on the ways of thrift and savings. Bank advertisements often included the names of prominent government officials such as Abraham Lincoln and Oliver Otis Howard, misleading customers and the public into believing that the federal government protected and guaranteed their deposits. Depositors were reminded during public meetings and other bank-sponsored gatherings that the bank was under congressional charter and thus under its complete protection. With such assurances where the deposits were safe, African Americans from a wide variety of backgrounds and occupations, many excited to be receiving a wage for their services for the first time in their lives, opened accounts with the Freedmen's Bank between 1868 and 1874 at an extraordinary rate. Within 10 years, 75,000 depositors, who were virtually all African Americans, trusted the bank by depositing more than 75 million, approximately 1.5 billion in today's dollars. Most of these deposits were being saved to buy land and other productive goods such as tools or agricultural supplies as depositors were told to do. All right, I'm just going to take a quick pause because this next paragraph is going to make me really upset. So I just gotta chill for a minute. Sorry, fam. And for those who are listening to this live and who's going to be listening on a replay, I apologize in advance. I gotta prepare for this paragraph. I mean, look, I try, at times to be not emotional about this stuff, and I try to just read it as if it's like, I don't want to make it personal. I just gotta kind of read it but just to know the atrocities, just to know, if our ancestors were just treated fairly. I mean, the levels of mass incarceration, the levels of Black families being separated, the level of so many things that hurt Black Americans today. I'm not going to say it wouldn't exist, but the likelihood of that, if people want to talk about probabilities, would be less greater than what it is today. All right. Thanks for hanging in there with me, fam. Thanks for hanging in there. I appreciate you. Let's continue. But the bank turned quickly from a savings bank to a risky private investment bank controlled by a small minority of trustees. Against the bank's original congressional charter and without the knowledge of the Black customers, who were largely unable to secure loans from the bank invested the money in risky railroad and real estate holdings to benefit white businessmen and bank managers. I'm putting this in the chat. It's going to make me curse. I'm trying not to curse. I'm not going to curse. I am not going to curse. I am not going to curse. It makes me want to. When on June 29, 1874, the bank failed and closed due to fraud, 61,131 mostly Black depositors lost about $2.9 million or $63 million in 2017 dollars. One study estimated the average amount owed to depositors across 71 bank failures of federally chartered banks between 1865 to 1933, and the Freedmen's Savings Bank ranked third for the largest amount owed to depositors at the time of the bank failure. Because the bank had represented much more than just a place to store money, the African Americans who lost their money also lost their trust in the federal government and in banks in general. State and private banks following emancipation refused to serve the credit needs of freedmen during the late 19th century, which meant that they had to rely on more expensive and exploitative credit systems. General stores became an important means of accessing short-term credit. Prices were at the discretion of the merchant. One price for goods purchased with cash and a higher price, often by 25%, for goods purchased with credit. Goods purchased on credit were charged interest of 8 to 15%, as determined by the personal judgment of the merchant, based on the creditworthiness of the borrower. Black-owned banks were established to provide banking services to Black communities. Approximately 130 Black-owned banks were established between 1900 and 1934. 15 savings and loans and credit unions were also established during this period. Only 8 banks survived the Great Depression out of 130 Black-owned banks. Today, there are only whopping, let's continue, 21 Black-owned banks nationwide and 32 Black-owned financial institutions overall, including credit unions. The federal government prevented the success of Black-owned banks by excluding them from full participation in the banking market. Black bank deposits were smaller and were more frequently withdrawn than white bank deposits, which made them more risky. Most Black depositors had no wealth to invest in the bank and were just depositing money from their wages while keeping small amounts to live on. They put their money into Black-owned banks not only for safekeeping, but also as a rainy day funds during bad times that came often. Because their deposits experienced high risk, Black-owned banks had to keep more cash as reserves or invest in other, more liquid assets such as government securities, which were safer than loans. They needed to make sure they always had enough cash at the bank to pay out to depositors. Black-owned banks also held very high capital ratios to offset this risk. For example, in 1920, the mean capital ratio for white banks was 18%, while the Black banks had an average capital ratio of 32.9%. This meant that the Black bank owners invested more of their own money in earnings in the bank to keep it secure. But this severely lessened their ability to make a profit or lend money. Another source of vulnerability for Black banks was their assets or loan portfolios. The fate of Black banks was tied up with the fate of Black businesses, which meant that Black banks lacked the diversified investments needed for safe and profitable banking. Most thriving banks hold a mix of commercial and real estate loans, but Black-owned banks made almost exclusively home loans because the vast majority of Black businesses were small service operations with no need for bank financing. As described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, the federal government generally labeled Black homeowners and Black neighborhoods as being at high risk of default, and white-owned banks generally refused to issue mortgages to Black homeowners. Black-owned banks often met the need and provided home loans to Black homebuyers. Since homes owned by African Americans were undervalued due to government redlining, the property held for collateral during the term of the loan immediately diminished in value, holding the perception that these loans were inherently risky investments. Therefore, there was no market for mortgages held by African Americans because of the devaluation of property owned by African Americans and the assumption that loans held by African Americans were inherently risky. This in turn meant that it was difficult for Black-owned banks to earn a profit from an investment portfolio that was largely composed of home loans to African American home buyers. All right, family, I'm just going to take a real quick break and I'll be right back. All right, family. Here we go. In California, black homesteaders can be traced back to 1900, when agricultural settlements were promoted at various times after the turn of the century in Yolo, San Bernardino, Tulare, and Fresno counties. At least two different efforts at colonization occurred in San Bernardino County between 1900 and 1910, including solicitation of families to homestead government land in the Sidewinder Valley, desert land near Victorville. Black homesteaders also established an agricultural settlement in 1908 in the town of Allensworth in Tulare County, which ultimately was depleted of a water supply necessary to sustain the settlement. The racial climate around African American colonies ranged from welcoming or neutral to hostile, although none have been reported to experience the kind of everyday violence and intimidation African Americans regularly experience in the South. Incarcerated people in California produces myriad products such as clothing, furniture, cleaning products, and food. They also perform a wide range of duties in areas such as laundry, kitchen, and general maintenance. The California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection employed around 1,600 incarcerated individuals to fight forest fires in May 2021. Some are paid as little as $1.45 a day, as discussed in Chapter 10. In an unjust legal system, advocates argue that this is exploitative, and does not necessarily help the incarcerated firefighters to find jobs once they are released. The costs of higher education are a larger burden for Black Californians. Generally, white Americans are twice as likely as African Americans to receive financial assistance from their families for higher education. Only 16% of very low-income Black California students receive a Cal Grant award. The state financial aid African Americans do receive is often insufficient, especially with respect to housing. 15% of white households in Los Angeles had student loan debt, in contrast with 20.5% of households headed by African Americans. Structural racial disparities regarding access to unemployment insurance, food stamps, and C-19 federal loans in a crisis and benefits for businesses also exist in California. From March through June 2020, 84.9% of California's Black labor force filed for unemployment benefits. Wow! 84.9%? Compared to 39.1% of the state's white labor force. I'm tripping. 84.9. Wow. What's the Black population here? I think 2.6 million. Out of that is around roughly 2 million-ish, I think, here. Don't quote me. Black Californians who received unemployment insurance during the pandemic received $293.90, the smallest median weekly benefit of any racial group, versus white claimants who received $394.90. California's version of food stamps, CalFresh, oh, boom, okay, I was right, generally maintains the same work requirements that disproportionately cut Black adults off from food assistance at the federal level. In 2016, California enrolled only 72% of eligible residents in CalFresh, the fifth lowest rate in the nation. It is also one of 10 states that manage food assistance programs at the county level, which tends to be more expensive and variable than administering the program at the state level. Black Californians make up 6.5% of the state's population, but 14.7% of participating CalFresh households. 6.1%. Okay. During the pandemic, one survey found that 20.2% of Black households with children sometimes or often did not have enough to eat in a four-week period spanning June and July, compared to 8.8% of white households with children. In California, an analysis of the distribution of federal loans found disparate distribution by race. African American neighborhoods received $444 per resident, while white neighborhoods received $666 per resident, partially due to lower concentration of small businesses or small business employees in African American neighborhoods. However, another analysis revealed that in most major metro areas in the country, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Diego, businesses in majority white areas also receive federal loans at a greater rate than businesses in majority African American areas. Here we go. Proposition 209 has also disadvantaged black-owned businesses in the state seeking public contracts with the state of California and local governments. Shout out to Ward Connolly. Passed in November 1996, Proposition 209 caused state and local governments to end race-conscious contracting programs, resulting in a loss of $1 billion to $1.1 billion every year for minority and women-owned businesses. The biggest contract loss for minority and women-owned businesses was with the state of California, where $823 million has been lost each year since Proposition 209. Before Proposition 209 passed in fiscal year 1994 to 1995, $519 million was contracted to minority and women-owned businesses, or about $823 million in October 2014 dollars. When California ended its program for minority and women-owned businesses, only a few got back their contracts with the state, and some never recovered. There was only an insignificant increase in small business enterprise procurement with the state after Prop 209, which is the main way that state contracts would be available for many of these businesses. The city and county of San Francisco lost about $200 million per year in minority and women-owned business contracts. Some of this loss emerged immediately after Proposition 209. More losses followed the 2004 Coral Construction case, which ultimately ended San Francisco's race-conscious procurement program. Proposition 209 also resulted in the loss of about $30 million per year in minority and women-owned business contracts with the city of Oakland. It also resulted in an estimated $20 million loss per year in such contracts with the city of San Jose after the 2000 high-voltage wireworks case, which ultimately ended San Jose's race-conscious contracting program. All right, let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. All right, let's go. Drivers of the wealth gap today. Unequal home ownership. Homes are one of the most important wealth assets that households can possess. People who own homes can use them to borrow money to pay for expenses or pay off high-interest debt in times of crisis. Homeowners are able to generate wealth through the home equity so long as their home increases or appreciates in value. Home ownership is also believed to be more beneficial than renting because owners build equity and obtain additional tax benefits. Homeowners may also face less housing instability than renters, partially because they tend to be more well-off in general, especially during a crisis, and may therefore be less likely to lose their housing. Housing affordability problems, where an occupant must pay more than 30% of gross income for housing costs, including utilities, are more than twice as common among renters and owners. As discussed in Chapter 5, housing segregation and above, government discrimination made it difficult for African Americans to buy real estate, gain wealth through real estate, and transfer that wealth to successive generations. Widespread home ownership in the United States was created through government action, starting with New Deal legislation. The New Deal created relatively safe long-term mortgage markets and reduced down payment requirements for home ownership. This transformed the housing landscape, allowing many working-class households to move from the rental lifestyle to owning a home. Yet, as described above and in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, the path to home ownership has been riddled with entrenched racism. Today, African Americans are in worse position than white Americans to have homes as assets to aid them in a crisis. The racial home ownership gap was 19% in 1940 and grew to 28% in 2009. As of the second quarter of 2020, out of $30.8 trillion in real estate assets in the U.S., black households have 5% and white households, oh God. Oh man. As of the second quarter of 2020, this was that 2 years ago? As of the second quarter of 2020, out of $30.8 trillion in real estate assets in the U.S., black households held 5% and white households held 78%. In 2019, 42.8% of African Americans own homes versus 73.3% of white Americans, and are more likely to face affordability issues in securing capital to purchase and sustain housing at 30% of their gross income, including utilities. In the same year, researchers for the National Bureau of Economic Research also found that black mortgage borrowers were charged higher interest rates than white borrowers were, and were denied mortgages that would have been approved for white applicants. Pause. All right, so let's see here. African Americans who own homes have a greater reliance on the house as a source of wealth than white households. In 2014, home equity accounted for 92% of African Americans' net worth. There is a gap between the appreciation of a home owned by a white family and the appreciation of a similar home owned by a black family. When African Americans do own homes, they tend to be appraised for less than comparable white homes, limiting the amount of money that can be taken out of their home equity. Race affects the rate of return on home asset. African American homeowners had a median home equity of $66,800 in 2019. White homeowners had a median home equity of $130,000 in the same year. Residential segregation contributes to the undervaluing of houses in black neighborhoods. African American homeowners tend to own homes appraised far less or for less in neighborhoods deemed as less valuable, which decreases their available equity relative to white homeowners. Even controlling for factors like neighborhood or home quality, a study has found systemic undervaluation of homes in black neighborhoods attributable to anti-black bias. Major companies offering real estate insurance have been accused of targeting inner city neighborhoods where black families live by denying claims as fraudulent. All of this limits African Americans' access to benefits of home equity in a crisis. African Americans also experience significant housing cost burdens without sufficient wealth in the first place. Black households have limited means to invest in home ownership. In 2019, 43% of black households spent more than 30% of their income on housing, compared with 25% of white households. Discrimination in mortgage lending may also make it more difficult for black homeowners to access their home equity through cash-out refinancing, a means of accessing home equity that has been increasingly popular during the pandemic. Between April 2020 and January 2021, less than a quarter of black homeowners who could have saved $200 a month by refinancing did so, compared to 40% of similarly situated white homeowners. But closing the home ownership gap alone will not close the racial wealth gap. The home ownership gap alone does not explain the racial wealth gap. Among black and white American households who do not own a home, white households still have 31 times more wealth than African American households. Fewer assets. Black households hold less assets than white households overall, but black households hold a higher proportion of assets in their cars and homes, and less in net liquid and net business assets. Black households are also generally less likely to hold financial assets. African Americans have substantially fewer assets than white people at every income level, including bank deposits, stocks, bonds, and loans. African Americans tend to have fewer investments. Some studies argue that African American investment patterns generally show risk aversion and lack of education on stocks and investments. They argue that wealthier African Americans tend to save more and invest less compared to wealthier white Americans, and that white Americans are more likely than African Americans to invest in high risk, high reward assets. For example, in 2004, African American families were less likely than white families to have investment accounts and retirement accounts. Only 44% of African Americans have retirement savings accounts with a typical balance of around $20,000, compared to 65% of white Americans who have an average balance of $50,000 according to Federal Reserve. And only 34% of African Americans own any stocks or mutual funds, compared to more than half of white people. Some studies claim that this can be attributed to familiar influence. Black families are less likely to have investment accounts if their parents didn't have any. Other studies argue that African Americans are not significantly more risk averse or less financially literate than white people with similar levels of income and wealth. Further, African Americans engage in entrepreneurship, which presents inherent risk at higher rates than white Americans with similar levels of income and wealth. Low wealth, lack of financial inclusion, and financial constraints on choice often forces Black borrowers to use predatory and abusive alternative financial services rather than financial literacy. Fewer assets. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Got that? Okay. African Americans have less liquid assets. Liquid assets accessible as cash in times of crisis include cash savings, checking accounts, saving accounts, money market funds, certificates of deposit, and government bonds. Access to liquid assets is important in a crisis as it enables people to continue to pay bills in the event of a sudden loss of income, or pay for emergency expenses such as medical costs. Lack of access to liquid assets can heighten the impact of crisis by making it harder to afford basic necessities. People may also turn to family for economic support in times of hardship. In addition, access to government aid such as an unemployment insurance, nutrition subsidies, and crisis-specific programs such as stimulus checks and small business loans help people and their businesses stay afloat. These resources are vital for surviving economic crises. For example, liquid assets such as cash savings help people pay bills in the event of a job loss or weather emergency expenses like a medical emergency. Similarly, people who have home stocks or retirement funds may leverage their home value for a loan, liquidate stocks, or borrow from or against their retirement accounts to pay for expenses during difficult economic times. African American households tend to disproportionately lack access to many of these resources, often due to the persistence of historical disparities and racism that continues today. In 2019, while 96.8% of African American families had some kind of liquid asset, such as a checking account, savings account, or prepaid card, typical African American families with liquid assets had 1,500 in liquid savings compared to 8,100 for white families with liquid assets. Racism in the banking system today still create barriers to liquid assets for Black customers. Black customers are sometimes profiled, viewed with suspicion just for entering a bank, and questioned over the basic transactions. African Americans have less non-liquid assets. In general, non-liquid assets such as homes, stocks, and retirement funds can support financial security by increasing resources necessary to weather a crisis or invest in wealth-generating assets for the future. As discussed above, African Americans experience myriad barriers to home ownership and the mortgage market. Stocks and mutual funds, which can be sold, and retirement funds, which can be liquidated or borrowed against, also provide potential sources of aid in a crisis. African Americans are also less likely to own stocks than white Americans, and African Americans who own stocks have less liquidity than white Americans do. While 61% of white households own any form of stocks, only 33.5% of African Americans households do. Among families who own stocks, the typical white family has access to $50,600 they could tap in an emergency. Yep. Compared to $14,400 for the typical African American family. While African Americans are more likely to have access to retirement accounts than homes or other types of stocks, they are still less likely than white Americans to have them. Around 55% of African Americans' working age families have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan, and 45% participate. 70% of white working age families have access to an employer-sponsored retirement plan, and 60% of them participate. Among working age white families with balances in such accounts, the typical white family has approximately $50,000 saved, whereas a comparable African American family has approximately $20,000 saved. During the pandemic, a survey found that African American households with retirement accounts were much more likely to report that they planned on withdrawing from or borrowing against them, 48% and 45%, than white households at 29% and 29%, due to relative lack of other assets. However, withdrawing money from retirement accounts can incur tax and other penalties. Facts. Lower business ownership. Business ownership allows African Americans to participate in local, regional, and global markets from which they have historically been excluded due to systemic racism and discrimination. Equity in a business is among one of the types of assets that are more unequally distributed by race. Lower wealth for African Americans leads to lower business ownership and self-employment. Studies have demonstrated the substantial wealth advantages to self-employment and have shown that those who become self-employed show much stronger gains in wealth compared to individuals who never become self-employed. This is especially true for Black business owners, given that the median net worth for Black business owners is 12 times higher than Black non-business owners. Further, Black business ownership is a viable path to creating wealth not only for Black business owners, but also for Black communities at large. Most small businesses tend to hire from the community, which tends to create job opportunities for community residents. Therefore, the success of Black-owned business is a critical path for economic empowerment in Black communities. The Center for Financial Household Stability and the Federal Reserve Board of St. Louis have documented that compared to white individuals, African Americans own fewer of their assets in the form of business assets. In terms of market share, Black-owned businesses are significantly underrepresented in comparison to white and other minority-owned businesses. In 2017, only 3.5% of all United States businesses were Black-owned compared to 81% white-owned. Although Black business ownership has been steadily increasing in the United States, growth has been tremendously slow. Several factors contribute to the racial disparity in American business ownership, such as systemic barriers to secure startup capital and the relatively small size of Black business. African Americans face many systemic barriers when seeking the social and financial capital necessary to start their own businesses that make it increasingly difficult for Black entrepreneurships to secure the financial capital necessary to launch or grow their own businesses. All right, just writing some notes here. All right. As a result, Black business ownerships typically start their businesses with half the capital of white business owners, despite the fact that they demonstrate a greater need for startup financing. According to Pepperdine's Private Capital Access Index report, approximately 80% of Black businesses sought financing for planned businesses growth for expansions compared to only 55% of all respondents. Although Black businesses demonstrate a greater desire and need to secure financing, due to discriminatory lending practices, Black business owners receive lower loan amounts and with less frequency than white business owners. For example, the median loan amount for Black business owners who are approved for credit is less than half of the loan amounts extended to their white counterparts. Another barrier to growth and development of black business is the fact that on average, the businesses owned by the African Americans are smaller than those owned by white Americans. A key factor for measuring the size of a business, whether the business has employees, and statistics show that black-owned businesses are much less likely to have employees than white-owned businesses. In 2012, for example, 23.9% of businesses owned by white men had employees, where only 6% of businesses owned by black men had employees. Although the size of a business has a significant influence on the profitability of a business, even black-owned businesses with employees tend to be much less profitable than white-owned businesses with employees. In 2014, 63.4% of white-owned businesses with employees indicated that they were profitable, compared to reported profitability of only 45.6% of black-owned businesses with employees. In addition, the top 100 black-owned businesses combined earned less than $30 billion in 2014. Walmart earned $482 billion, or 16 times that. The challenges faced by black business owners were further exacerbated by the economic hardships caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Federal Reserve Bank. Okay, let me see. All right, family, we're almost done here. Hey, we could do it. Let's see if we can get done here. No, we're going to get it done. Of the New York reports that about 58% of black-owned businesses were at risk of financial distress before the pandemic, compared to approximately 20% of white-owned businesses. The financial instability experienced by black-owned businesses made these businesses particularly vulnerable at the onset of the pandemic. According to a report by the House Committee on Small Businesses, black business ownership declined approximately 40%, more than any other racial group. During the first few months of the pandemic, black business owners such as Richard Anderson, the owner of Ken Folk Brass Band and Music Group, experienced significant economic distress as a result of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, Ken Folk Brass Band was one of the most popular bands in New Orleans and frequently performed at weddings and music festivals around the world. However, lockdown measures enacted to reduce the spread of COVID-19 forced all large events and gatherings to cease. Without any events to perform at, Ken Folk Brass Band and its band members, including owner Richard Anderson, suffered a significant loss of income. Oh yeah, in 2020. Yeah, that's facts, fam. Like, facts. That's straight up facts. California. Black Californians are much more likely to be renters and much more likely to be housing cost burden. For instance, 58.4% of black Californians are renters versus 34.1% for white Californians. Black Californians less likely to have access to the credit and housing stability that owning a home can provide in a crisis. Home ownership for black Californians lags behind the nationwide African Americans' home ownership rate, 33.3% versus 44% nationally in 2019. 63% of white Californians own their homes, while only 33% of black Californians do. Home ownership rates for African American households have fallen every decade for the last 30 years, but unconditionally and after controlling for income and demographics. Black Californians face higher price loans, more predatory lending, and more risk. During the housing crisis of the 2000s, California had the country's highest foreclosure rates, with Los Angeles leading the state. African American household foreclosure rates were 1.9 times that of white Americans, likely due to increased targeting of minority communities for predatory lending, as discussed above. Black Californians have less non-liquid assets. African Americans in Los Angeles own fewer stocks, mutual funds, investment trusts, individual retirement account, and or private annuity than white Angelenos. 18% of U.S.-born black households in Los Angeles do not have a car, the lowest of all reported ethnicities. While Californians in general face long commute times, black Californians in Los Angeles on average have a 7.5% longer commute. Quick pause, man, I'm just gonna say LA is really expensive to live in. And I know the Bay Area is too as well, but man, LA and San Diego, and those three cities, in Sacramento is catching up rather quickly. All right, let's continue. In Los Angeles, 11.7% of white households own a business versus 3.1% of African American households. Let's see where we're at. Okay. The harmful effects of the wealth gap, which cascade across generations, have resulted in racial differences in the capacity of African Americans to transmit resources across generations and lower financial resilience during crisis of discrimination tax structures. Fewer intergenerational wealth transfers. Lower assets of African Americans means that intergenerational wealth transfers are less likely and tend to be smaller. Inheritance, intergenerational wealth transfers, or parental wealth are primary sources of the capacity for sustained wealth building. Wealth more than income can be used to invest in appreciating assets for children, such as a college education, an unpaid internship in a high-rent city, a new business, a property in a better residential neighborhood, or a job in the family firm. Without wealth transfers, regardless of income, these assets are harder to attain. The fewer resources the older generation has to transfer to the next, the lower the wealth position attained by the younger generation. At least 26% of an adult's wealth position is directly due to inheritance or gift money, a conservative estimate. The true effect could be as high as 50%. Greater familial assistance contributes to white families' greater ability to buy better housing and get better deals on mortgages earlier in life, further compounding the home ownership and wealth gap and giving white families better security in crisis. An Urban Institute study estimates that the shortfall in large gifts and inheritances accounts for 12% of the black-white wealth gap. The impact of fewer intergenerational transfers is reflected in the wealth gap between black and white American millennials. While the typical white millennial family has about $88,000 in wealth, the typical black millennial family has only $5,000. I'm going to repeat that again for my fellow millennials out there. My millennial bootstrappers. I love y'all, fam. This is all love. While the typical white millennial family has about $88,000 in wealth, the typical black millennial family has only about $5,000 in wealth. That's a shame. White millennial families made huge strides between 2016 and 2019, and they now lag previous generations of white families by only about 5%. Between 2007 and 2019, however, black millennials fell further and further behind, not just compared with white millennials, but compared with previous generations of African Americans. While white millennials trail the wealth of previous generations of white Americans by only 5%, black millennials trailed previous generations of African Americans by 52%. The typical black millennial has $5,700 less in net worth than counterparts in previous generations. There are several reasons for this deep disparities between black and white millennials. First, white millennials are more likely to benefit from having wealthy parents. Greater familial assistance contributes to white families' greater ability to buy better housing and get better deals on mortgages early in life, further compounding the home ownership and wealth gap and giving white families better security in crisis. Their parents have more resources, for example, to help them with down payments on their first house or to help them pay off their student loans. About 80% of black millennials with at least a bachelor's degree still have student loan debt, compared with about half of white millennials. White millennials are also more likely to own assets like stocks and homes, which have ballooned in value in recent years. While about 2/3 of white millennials own homes, less than 1/3 of black millennials own homes. lower financial resilience during crisis. Support from family networks can provide a private safety net to aid with cash transfers, housing, or childcare in times of material hardship. Cash transfers can provide additional income, multi-generational housing can provide shelter, and family-provided childcare can permit a parent to work and earn income as well as avoid childcare expenses. For example, during the C-19 pandemic, almost a quarter of renters borrowed money from friends or family. Wow. While African Americans receive assistance from family members at high rates, their overall tendency to lack resources may reduce the availability quantity of such assistance and may result in economic harm to the giver. African American families are more likely than white families to have high poverty family networks and more likely to make repeated cash transfers, which hinders their ability to accumulate wealth. For example, in 2019, 71.9% of white families expected that they could get $3,000 from friends or family during a crisis, versus less than 40.9% of African American families. While new African American mothers are more likely to live in a relative's home, host a family member, and give or receive money than white mothers, helping family members in poverty may have negative consequences for struggling families. A pre-pandemic study found that while 31.7% of white households are liquid asset poor, meaning that they could not use their savings to live for 3 months at the federal poverty level, 62.7% of African American households are. And a 2020 study found that 36% of white families had enough savings to cover 6 months of expenses versus 14% of African American families. In one February 2021 survey of disadvantaged workers, 42% of white households reported that they could not pay for a $400 emergency expense without taking an additional debt, drawing down retirement accounts, or selling items, compared to 59% of African American households. African Americans are more likely to suffer from economic crises such as the C-19 pandemic. For example, a June 2020 survey found that while only 27% of white households had experienced financial hardship as a result of the pandemic, 40% of American households had. In addition, lack of access to liquid assets can also force people into financially risky options during a crisis, such as taking out predatory payday loans or high-interest credit card debt. Lack of access to liquid assets can also make it harder to afford food and rent. June 2020 census data showed that among households where a job was lost during the C-19 pandemic, 31% of African American households lacked sufficient food in the prior week, compared to 12% of white households. The data also show that compared to white renters, African American renters were less likely to have paid their rent in the previous month and more likely to predict that they would not be able to make their next rent payment. In a May 2020 survey, African American respondents were more than twice as likely as white respondents to report missing a credit card, utility, internet, rent, mortgage, or other important payment since the beginning of the pandemic. African American families with liquid assets also use them up more rapidly than white families during a crisis. African American families with emergency savings at the start of the pandemic were twice as likely as white households to have needed to use them by May, and more than twice as likely to have already spent at least a quarter of their savings. Discriminatory tax structures. More than 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, many wealth-building policies still continue to heavily favor households that do not need help building wealth, mostly wealthy, predominantly white households, while doing little or nothing for low-wealth African American households, among other households of color. The largest and most powerful of these programs operate through the U.S. tax code. These federal tax programs overwhelmingly favor building the wealth of the wealthy and has contributed to the extreme rise in overall wealth inequality over the past several decades. Tax policies have drastically different impacts on Black and white families and many were created during the time when black families paid into the system without having the same legal rights to live, work, marry, vote, or receive an education as their white peers. Really quick pause, just real quick regarding taxes. Now I'm starting to kind of understand why, some reparations advocates are talking about not paying taxes. Really starting to understand now. Whew. All right, so let's go. The modern income tax system traces its roots. Well, let me clarify that. Not paying taxes, not because we don't want to pay taxes, not paying taxes because, the debt is due. The debt is owed. Just clarification, interjection. All right, let's get back into it. The modern income tax system traces its roots to the Revenue Act of 1913, which instituted a progressive income tax system where tax rates increase as income increases, but did not envision African Americans as taxpayers at all. Even as African Americans eventually paid into the tax system after amendments and several new laws, they were unable to reap its benefits. Today, African Americans are paying more in taxes than their white peers because U.S. tax laws were designed with white Americans in mind. All right, the Revenue Act of 1913. Even as African Americans eventually paid into the tax system after amendments and several new laws, they were unable to reap its benefits. Today, African Americans are paying more taxes than their white peers because U.S. tax laws were designed with white Americans in mind. The federal government has spent more than $8 trillion in the past 20 years on tax programs to help families build long-term wealth through saving for retirement, buying a home, starting a business, or accessing higher education. This spending has resulted in the typical millionaire receiving about $145,000 in public tax benefits to grow their wealth, while working families get a total average of only $174. Although the Internal Revenue Service does not collect race or ethnicity data, recent research indicates that overwhelming amount of the spending the federal government does through the tax code goes to white households at all income levels. So, real quick interjection. Obviously, the IRS needs to start disaggregating data. All right, they need to start doing that. Examining individuals earning $103,466 or more reveals that white people accounted for 79% of those respective filers, while black people accounted for only 6%. These individuals also took greater advantage of high-value tax benefits, which cost the government hundreds of billions of dollars each year. For example, in 2012, white people made up 83% of the residents in the zip codes with the highest percentage of tax returns reporting capital gains and mortgage interest deductions. But African Americans made up just 3% of residents in the zip codes reporting the highest rates of capital gains income and 6% of residents in zip codes reporting the highest rates of mortgage interest deductions. These two tax programs together cost the federal program more than $100 billion during that year. California. In California, Los Angeles provides a stark version of nationwide racial disparities in liquid assets accessible during a crisis. A 2014 study of the Los Angeles metro area found that the median value of liquid assets for U.S. African American households was $200 compared to $110,000 for white households. While 91.6% of white households had some kind of liquid asset, only 62.3% of U.S.-born African American households did. Further, 90.1% of white households had a checking account versus 68.1% of U.S.-born African American households. In addition, 71.9% of white households had a savings account versus 55.5% of U.S.-born African American households. While 40.7% of white households had stocks, mutual funds, or investment trusts, only 21.5% of U.S.-born African American households did. Finally, 63.6% of white households had an individual retirement account on private annuity account for a private annuity versus 37.9% of U.S.-born African American households. In California, many current state tax policies benefit Californians with higher incomes and wealth, predominantly white and Asian Californians, and give little to no benefits to other Californians, including Black Californians. For example, many tax benefits are only available to those who opt to itemize their tax deductions, and people who itemize tend to have higher incomes. California's 4 largest personal income tax deductions provide most benefits to families with incomes over $100,000, while providing nearly no benefits to those with incomes below $20,000. Black Californians are more likely to have low incomes, so they are less likely to benefit from tax breaks. California's several tax benefits from homeowners, including the deductions for mortgage interest and property taxes, are also unlikely to benefit Black Californians who have been blocked from homeownership through racist policies and practices, often lack funds for a down payment, and have lower value homes due to residential segregation and racist appraisal practices. Oh, yeah. Here we are, family. I wish we had some kind of like New Year's like music. You know how they do the New Year's thing with the music and all of this stuff. Woo! All right, conclusion. The legacy of slavery continues to reach into the lives of African Americans today. For hundreds of years, the American government at the federal, state, and local levels has systemically prevented African American communities from building, maintaining, and passing on wealth due to the racial hierarchy established to maintain enslavement. Segregation, racial terror, harmful racist neglect, and other atrocities in nearly every sector of civil society have inflicted harms which cascade over a lifetime and compound over generations. As a result, African Americans today experience a large and persistent wealth gap when compared to white Americans. Addressing this persistent racial wealth gap means undoing long-standing institutional arrangements that have kept African American households from building and growing wealth at the same rate as white households to the present day. Ladies and gentlemen, wow. That concludes the marathon read, family, of the California Reparations Interim Report. Wow. Y'all, we did it. We did it, family. So, I want y'all to have a wonderful night. I told y'all we was going to get through this. We did get through this. I want y'all to keep positive. I want y'all to keep steadfast. I want y'all to keep energized. I want y'all to keep motivated. I want y'all to keep focused. Okay? And I want to thank the California Reparations Task Force, and shout out to the California DOJ for putting this wonderful document together. The first time in the history of the United States of America has a report of this magnitude came to fruition. This is historical. You are historical. We are historical. Thank you, Darlene. You're amazing. Shout out to Kim. She's amazing. Shout out to everybody who's listening and who will be listening to this. Shout out to future freedmen and women and freed people, and to the allies. And to everyone, regardless of what color, creed you are, if you're a person of justice, then you will also seek to ally and to be a part of the healing process of those who built this country. Facts on facts on facts. So we do here, we put in the work. Y'all put in the work as well. All right, family, thank you once again. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy. Thank you, ancestors, for giving me, for giving my biz partner, Kim, and everybody else, the patience, the resolve, the understanding, the fortitude, the wisdom, the intelligence to keep this thing, this reparations train moving. Because once again, our ancestors built this country. On that note, y'all, love, peace, and reparations. And we actually are going to have a session, a midterm madness session this Sunday. I know I got to update the slide, but I know it's an old slide, but yeah, 11 a.m., which will be on, gosh, wow, the 30th. Okay, so that's October 30th, 2022 at 11 p.m. So please join us there as we wrap up, enjoying the conversation. Join in the conversation as we move forward on this reparations train. All right, family, we got to cut that check. They got to cut that check. Well, you guys have a wonderful night. And on that note, once again, love, peace, and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but freed people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I gotta show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.